In the spring of 1960, Lucille Ball faced the press with a composure that belied the storm behind her eyes. She announced the end of her marriage to Desi Arnaz, a union that had not only defined her personal life, but had also shaped the history of television. For fans, it felt unthinkable. These were the people who had brought Lucy and Ricky Ricardo to life, the couple who made audiences laugh every Monday night, and, in doing so, made them believe in the possibility of enduring love. On screen, they were perfect. Off screen, they were icons. But away from the stage lights and scripted laughs, there was another story unfolding, one that was layered with ambition, exhaustion, and wounds too deep to heal. What ended their marriage wasn't a single explosive betrayal. It was a gradual unraveling, built over years, and rooted in the very things that had once made them inseparable. It was 1940 when Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz first crossed paths on the set of the RKO musical Too Many Girls. She was 28, a seasoned contract player whose career was steady but still waiting for that one defining role. He was 23, a Cuban-born band leader whose charisma could command an audience before he even struck the first note. Their meeting was a collision of energies, hers disciplined and sharp, his spontaneous and magnetic. The chemistry was undeniable, and within months, they were married in an intimate whirlwind ceremony. It was a match driven by passion, and, for a time, that passion seemed enough to bridge any difference between them. But their lives were built on very different rhythms. Desi's work kept him on the road for weeks at a time, performing in packed nightclubs and concert halls across the country. Lucille's world revolved around the soundstage, bound by the rigid schedule of Hollywood film production. The time apart was not only difficult, it was corrosive. Rumors of Desi's flirtations while on tour reached Lucille more than once. She dismissed some as gossip, but others landed too close to the truth to ignore. Arguments would flare, sharp and emotional, before giving way to equally passionate reconciliations. By the mid-1940s, it was becoming clear to both of them that their marriage needed more than love to survive. Lucille, whose mind was always working ahead of the moment, began to think strategically. If they could work together, if their careers could intersect, then the distance, physical and emotional, might finally close. She began exploring the idea of television, a medium still in its infancy. It was risky. Movie stars didn't migrate to television. It was seen as a step down. But Lucille saw its potential, not only as a performer, but as a solution to the most pressing problem in her marriage. When her radio comedy, My Favorite Husband, caught the attention of CBS, the network offered her the chance to adapt it into a television show. Lucille agreed, but with one condition. Desi would play her on-screen husband. Executives balked, certain that American audiences would never accept a Cuban bandleader as the spouse of an all-American redhead. Lucille refused to back down. This wasn't just about casting. It was about salvaging her marriage. To prove the pairing would work, she and Desi took a vaudeville-style stage show on the road. The tour was a success, the chemistry undeniable, and CBS relented. That decision would change both their lives. Together, they would create one of the most beloved shows in television history. Yet, even in these early victories, the same dynamics that had once threatened their marriage still lingered beneath the surface. The question was no longer whether they could be together. It was whether the very thing that united them, their work, might one day pull them apart. When I Love Lucy premiered in 1951, television comedy would never be the same again. Lucille Ball, with her fearless physical humor and razor-sharp timing, brought Lucy Ricardo to life in a way that made audiences feel like they knew her personally. Desi Arnaz, as Ricky, played the perfect counterbalance. Charming, exasperated, and always a step behind his wife's next scheme. What viewers didn't see was how much of this success rested on the risks they had taken before the cameras ever rolled. Lucille had insisted Desi be cast, despite every warning from executives who said America wouldn't accept a mixed heritage couple. She had fought that battle not just for the sake of the show, but for the sake of their marriage. The gamble paid off almost instantly. By the second season, I Love Lucy was the most watched show in the country, pulling in ratings numbers television had never seen. Audiences planned their weeks around Monday nights, gathering in living rooms to watch Lucy's latest antics. Behind the scenes, Desi was more than just a co-star. He was a producer, an innovator, and a businessman with a sharp eye for efficiency. Together, they formed Desilu Productions, a company that would quietly revolutionize how sitcoms were made. They pioneered the three-camera setup, filmed in front of a live studio audience, and insisted on shooting on high-quality film, which would later make reruns possible. This was groundbreaking. Without realizing it, they had not only created a hit show, but reshaped the business model of television. Their personal lives, at least in public, seemed equally charmed. Their daughter Lucy had been born in 1951, the same year the show debuted. In 1953, the fictional birth of their son on television coincided with the real-life arrival of Desi Jr., an event that drew over 44 million viewers, more than the audience for President Eisenhower's inauguration the following day. In the eyes of the public, Lucille and Desi were living the perfect American dream. A loving marriage, 2 children, and a career that kept them side by side. But perfection, as always, came at a cost. The demands of producing a hit show were relentless. Desi oversaw the growing empire of Desilu, expanding into other shows and acquiring more production contracts. Lucille, meanwhile, shouldered the responsibility of keeping I Love Lucy fresh and funny week after week. She was a perfectionist, unwilling to settle for anything less than excellence. Desi, for all his brilliance, was more impulsive, willing to take big risks, both in business and in life, and sometimes bringing trouble to their doorstep in the process. Even at the height of their success, small fractures began to appear. The constant workload left little time for them to simply be husband and wife. Desi's late nights, whether spent negotiating deals or unwinding with friends, fueled gossip columns that had long hinted at his wandering eye. Lucille heard the rumors but focused on the work, determined not to let anything derail the momentum they had built. Still, friends noticed the change. The warmth between them, once effortless, now required more effort to sustain. By the mid-1950s, Desilu was one of the most powerful studios in television, and I Love Lucy was a cultural institution. The dream they had built together had exceeded anything either could have imagined in those early days. Yet, the very thing they had hoped would keep them close, working together every day, was beginning to quietly push them apart. By the late 1950s, the empire Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz had built was at its peak. Desilu Productions had become a powerhouse, producing not only I Love Lucy, but a growing slate of other successful series. The couple were no longer just actors, they were industry leaders, shaping the future of television. Yet, beneath the achievements, the personal cost of that success was becoming harder to hide. Desi's responsibilities as a producer and executive had grown enormously. He was negotiating new deals, overseeing multiple productions, and managing a staff whose livelihoods depended on the company's continued growth. Lucille's creative workload was just as heavy. She wasn't only starring in the show, she was deeply involved in its development, rehearsals, and editing. The long hours on set, the business meetings, and the endless cycle of production left little time for the intimacy that had once anchored their marriage. It was during this period that Desi's habits began to draw more attention, both from the press and from Lucille herself. His late nights often involved drinking and gambling, And though much of it was framed as business entertainment, the line between work and pleasure was blurry. Gossip columns hinted at infidelity. Whether the stories were exaggerated or not, they chipped away at Lucille's trust. She had fought so hard to keep Desi by her side in their work, but now she found herself feeling isolated, even when he was sitting right next to her in a production meeting. In 1957, I Love Lucy shifted into the Lucy-Desi Comedy Hour. On screen, their chemistry still sparkled, but those who worked with them began to notice subtle changes. Arguments over scripts became sharper. Rehearsals sometimes turned tense, with Lucille's perfectionism clashing against Desi's more relaxed, improvisational style. Once, disagreements would end with laughter. Now, they sometimes lingered into the evening, unresolved. Friends close to the couple later said that the public image of the perfect pair had become almost suffocating. They felt pressure to maintain it, to smile for the cameras, no matter what was happening at home. The more they played those roles for the world, the less space there was to be honest with each other. The success of Desilu also brought an entirely new kind of strain. As the company expanded, it took on projects that demanded more of Desi's time and energy. The bigger the studio grew, the more it pulled him away from Lucille, not physically, but emotionally. She was watching the man she had once fought so hard to keep close drift into another universe entirely, one filled with deals, contracts, and boardrooms. And when he came home, she often felt she was getting what was left of him, not the man she had married. By the end of 1958, the cracks in their marriage were no longer invisible. They still shared moments of warmth, but they were fleeting, often overshadowed by tension. Their on-screen kisses remained convincing to viewers. Yet those who knew them well sensed that the intimacy was increasingly part of the performance. The partnership that had once been their salvation was slowly becoming another arena for conflict, a stage where the audience laughed, even as the couple playing the roles was starting to break apart. In 1959, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz were still one of television's most recognizable couples. Yet, the emotional distance between them had never been greater. The Lucy-Desi Comedy Hour continued to draw solid ratings, but the magic that had once defined their work and their marriage was wearing thin. Disagreements over scripts, budgets, and creative direction spilled beyond the soundstage. What had once been resolved with a knowing glance or shared laugh now hardened into silence. The tension was no longer something they could hide from those working closest to them. Desi had become consumed by his role as the driving force behind Desilu Productions. The studio was expanding rapidly, taking on ambitious new projects that demanded constant negotiation and strategic maneuvering. He was in and out of meetings, flying across the country, courting sponsors and affiliates. The energy that once went into their relationship was now spread thin across a business empire. Lucille, meanwhile, remained deeply entrenched in the creative side of their work, determined to keep their shows sharp and engaging. But, without realizing it, they had stopped meeting in the middle. Each was fighting their own battles, and those battles no longer aligned. There were still moments that reminded them of what they had built together, a shared memory between takes, a small joke that cracked through the tension, but they were fleeting. More often, their conversations were transactional. Schedules, production notes, financial updates. Lucille began to feel that the partnership they had fought so hard to protect had transformed into something purely professional. The marriage had become the business, and the business was wearing them both down. By early 1960, the strain had reached a breaking point. Lucille filed for divorce, citing extreme cruelty, a legal term that didn't begin to capture the complicated truth. There had been love, more than most couples ever experience. But there had also been years of suspicion, long absences, and the unrelenting weight of shared fame. She knew that leaving would be painful, but staying had become impossible. Their final on-screen appearance together came that same year, during the last episode of the Lucy-Desi Comedy Hour. The storyline called for a kiss, nothing unusual for Lucy and Ricky Ricardo, but those who were there that day remembered it as different. It lasted a beat longer than usual. It was tender, almost bittersweet, and carried a weight that went unnoticed by the millions watching at home. For Lucille and Desi, it was more than a scripted moment. It was a quiet farewell to the life they had shared. When news of the divorce broke, fans were stunned. To many, it felt like losing a part of their own lives. They had grown up with Lucy and Ricky, with the belief that this was a couple who could survive anything. But what the public saw had always been just one side of the story. Off-screen, they were two people who had tried, and for a long time succeeded in turning love into both a marriage and a creative empire. In the end, it was the demands of that empire, combined with the cracks that had been there from the start, that pulled them apart. When the divorce was finalized in 1960, it marked the end of an era not just for Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, but for an entire chapter in American entertainment. Lucille, now a single mother to Lucy and Desi Jr., made a decision that would surprise even those closest to her. She purchased Desi's shares of Desilu Productions, taking full control of the studio. In doing so, she became the first woman to run a major television production company in Hollywood history. It was a bold step, one that would cement her as a trailblazer not just in comedy, but in the industry as a whole. Under her leadership, Desilu would produce some of the most influential shows of the decade, including Star Trek and Mission Impossible. Desi, on the other hand, chose a different path. After years of operating at a relentless pace, he stepped back from the spotlight. He remarried, relocated to California's Del Mar region, and immersed himself in quieter pursuits, horse racing, sailing, and occasional producing projects that allowed him to stay connected to the business without being consumed by it. In interviews, he spoke fondly of the years with Lucille, though he never shied away from acknowledging the difficulties. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the love they shared had been real, even if it had not been built to survive the life they had created. The divorce did not sever their bond completely. Over the years, Lucille and Desi remained in contact, particularly for family milestones. They came together for their children's birthdays, graduations, and special events. At times, those who saw them together said the old spark was still there. Not romantic, but warm, familiar, and full of unspoken history. There was a mutual respect that had survived the fights, the disappointments, and the finality of the divorce. In the 1970s and 1980s, as television evolved and their original work became the stuff of legend, the world began to look back at I Love Lucy with renewed admiration. Lucille continued acting, starring in new series and making guest appearances, while Desi largely remained behind the scenes. But as the reruns aired for new generations, their faces forever preserved in black and white reminded audiences of a time when they were at their best, both on and off screen. By 1986, Desi's health had begun to decline. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, and word quickly reached Lucille. Despite years apart, she called him frequently, offering comfort and conversation. Friends close to them said the calls were long, filled with laughter, memories, and an ease that had not existed in their marriage's final years. On the 30th of November of that year, just one day before what would have been their 46th wedding anniversary, Desi passed away at the age of 69. In the days after his death, Lucille spoke sparingly about her grief, but when she did, her words carried the weight of a lifetime. She called Desi the love of her life, a statement that surprised some but made perfect sense to those who knew them. They had been partners in a way few couples ever are bound, not just by romance, but by a shared dream, that had changed the face of television. Their story, in the end, was not one of failure. It was one of extraordinary ambition, creative genius, and a love that, even when it could no longer sustain a marriage, never truly faded. For millions of fans, they would always be Lucy and Ricky. But for each other, they would remain something far deeper. The person who had seen them at their most brilliant and at their most human. The marriage of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz was never as simple as the world wanted it to be. It was built on extraordinary love, tested by extraordinary circumstances, and ultimately undone by the very success they had dreamed of creating together. From the moment they met in 1940, their lives were intertwined in ways that defied convention. Together, they transformed television, pioneered new ways to tell stories, and proved that the chemistry between two people could become a cultural phenomenon. Yet, their story is also a reminder that love alone cannot withstand the relentless pressures of fame, ambition, and constant scrutiny. In trying to protect their marriage, they built an empire, and in building that empire, they lost the quiet connection that had first drawn them together. For Lucille, the years after their divorce were defined by resilience and groundbreaking achievements. For Desi, they were about finding peace beyond the glare of the spotlight. But for both, the memory of what they had created and the bond that survived beyond the marriage never faded. Their relationship did not end with bitterness. It ended with an enduring respect, a shared history, and an unspoken acknowledgement that they had been partners in something rare. They had known each other in ways no one else ever could. And even decades later, Lucille would still call Desi the love of her life. For audiences, the images of Lucy and Ricky will always be frozen in time. The laughter, the mischief, the moments of tenderness that made them unforgettable. But behind those images lies a truer story, one of triumph, sacrifice, and a love that outlasted the marriage it began in. For more emotional stories, check out this video.